Friday night, and that means that we finally have the patch notes for the mid-season balance update coming to Season 3. These are the changes that are going to be in effect when we're able to start running the Gauntlet, the new aspirational content that you might have seen your boy commentating for the live showcase. Hope that y'all enjoyed it. I had an absolutely amazing time. Thank you very much to the Blizzard team for bringing me out for that. That was very cool. I do appreciate it. Thank you all so much. I hope I was able to add a little bit to it for you. That being said, we have the patch notes. Let's go ahead and get down into the nitty gritty because there's a lot to cover here for the Necromancer. This is all going to be Necromancer focused. You know, it's the only class that I play. And as far as the changes go, we go from the absolute nothing burgers, which is the return of the vampiric powers, all the way down to the ridiculous amount of buffs that they just kept layering on top of every single skill the Necromancer has. I'm unironically hyper excited because we're going to see some pretty amazing shifts in the meta if my predictions for how this all impacts the class as a whole will come to pass. I also went and tabulated every single change, whether or not it applied to each build that I currently think exists for the Necromancer, as well as the addition to just a pure Corpse Explosion Necromancer that I think we're ultimately going to make a build guide for on max roll, because I think at this point it's nuanced enough to be able to have its own guide. But I went through every single change, whether or not it's used on the build at all, whether or not it is a buff. Obviously, there's not really nerfs here to speak of, and whether or not everything was a nothing burger, something that you don't need to worry about that. On top of that, I wrote down some incredibly long-winded messages about my thoughts about these things, but rather than just hand you all this sheet, which is obviously linked down below, as well as all of the timestamps if you just want to hop around to the individual builds that you're interested in. But I went and broke down all of the changes per build that you can see across the multitude of different sheets that we have here, as well as talking about my personal tier list for Necromancer builds. So keep this in mind. This is not in comparison to the other builds in the game for the other classes. This is how I think the Necromancer builds currently rank up against one another for total endgame content, the concept of speed farming, which will be incredibly important for things like the Gauntlet that's coming up, as well as the leveling experience. So what I think I ultimately want to do is basically just go by clusters of builds, since a lot of them have very similar changes applying to all of them. We're going to start with Bone, move over to Shadow, then move over to Blood, and then move over to Minions. So again, timestamps down below, you can take a look at every single thing. And then I'm going to talk about why I think that the builds have moved in the tier list in the ways that they did, and the reason why I'm not just immediately pushing everything up to S tier, even though the majority of builds here have actually seen pretty extreme buffs to their overall damage output. And I'm just kind of kudos, hats off to the developers for finally realizing that the Necromancer had a power problem, and they're willing to give us answers for that. So like I said, starting off with the Bone builds, most notably Bone Spear didn't receive altogether that many changes here, and it makes sense. Bone Spear is widely considered to be the best Necromancer build that currently exists, and it's absolutely my front runner for bringing it into the Gauntlet. With some of the changes to things like Blood Surge and Sever a little bit later on, that might change, but at least for right now, we aren't seeing an incredible amount of additional strength being brought to the build. And that similarly goes for Bone Spirit, as well as Spear-It, the hybrid between Bone Spear and Bone Spirit that you might have seen at the beginning of the latter season when I first started playing, or just kind of seeing various people showcasing it because it's a pretty decent build. Death's approach is probably going to be the biggest hot topic, where a lot of people are going to have a lot of opinions. What happened was they took a passive that said we gain damage versus distant enemies, and instead they changed it to we gain movement speed. That's just good. Movement speed is the ultimate multiplier of total efficiency, as well as various mobility skills in any ARPG. I want to use this example just because I see a lot of people making not bad faith arguments. They're not malicious, but they are inappropriately evaluating damage versus mobility here. But if you ever played Diablo 2, the grandfather of ARPGs, name the one rune word that comes to mind, knowing that I'm about to ask you this question about how important is mobility. Did you say Enigma? Did you say teleport? You of course did, because it turns out that if your character can move faster to its farming spot, inside of its farming spot, or inside of combat itself, you are a more efficient build. It means even people like the Amazon, which had absolutely terribly slow casting frames for its animation, still used Enigma because it was that much stronger. Sadly, the Necromancer doesn't have any mobility skills. We don't have a dash, we don't have a teleport, we don't have the ability to jump over walls. The only thing that we can gain is run walk speed. And in this case, being at the max cap for run walk is something that we very typically couldn't do unless we were using suboptimal stats like after killing an elite monster. And it turns out that sometimes you kill the elite before you're done with the combat scenario. So you weren't even always benefiting 100% from that bonus depending on your content. What it meant was even with Reaper's Pursuit, as well as movement speed on your amulet, as well as on your boots, and with a mobility aspect on your boots, We just didn't regularly hit the movement cap of 200% total movement. So with the addition of this, every single Necromancer build can now feasibly hit that movement speed cap. And at that point, you can start worrying about scaling the rest of your builds efficiently. Most notably, attack speed, another thing that people tend to sleep on. And then after that, your damage scalers. Because it turns out most of the Necromancer builds are already capable of like multi-shotting any boss, one-shotting most trash minions, as well as being able to gun down in 2 or 3 casts most other elite monsters. We don't need more damage, guys. What we need is mobility and utility. They changed it over to here. I think it's a great change. You're going to see this across the board. I consider it a buff for every single Necromancer build because you are going to find 3 skill points to be able to put into this skill hard stop. It's just a really good option. For the people concerned about losing out on boss damage from that distant node, they have increased the damage bonus from Inner Calm, which means that any boss killing setup like Lilith or Duriel or any of the various endgame bosses that you want have regained Inner Calm now as the best overall damage aspect to be able to slot into a free slot. So as opposed to using like Conceited, which is only a 25 multiplier, Inner Calm now gets you a 40% multiplier. So that's like a pretty decent little change for anybody looking for very specifically boss killing setups. Obviously, the increase in damage to Corpse Explosion as well as to Plagued Corpse Explosion helps out any build which is going to be using the Black River plus Sacrilegious Ring auto corpse consumption engine for their build. So just increasing that overall damage means that you can more reliably utilize that to be able to clear out the next pack as opposed to just buttering it up. That being said, you're already typically doing enough damage with plus ranks to corpse skills on your amulet to be able to accomplish that in Nightmare Dungeon 100 scenarios. So other than slightly increasing your damage against single targets, which is one of the things that that engine typically removed from your build was the ability to stack single target damage better, you're going to recoup some of that. And maybe it all comes out in the wash now. Then there's a couple little things here. And again, this goes for either Bone Spear, Bone Spirit, or Spirit Hybrid. The change to Bone Prison, meaning that it now applies vulnerable for 8 seconds, as opposed to just applying vulnerable as long as Bone Prison is on the target. It's actually a pretty foundationally powerful change. It now allows you to bridge the gap in between casts so you can reliably have 100% uptime on vulnerable, just from the activation of this one skill, which also gets you essence, which also can get you essence on kill as well, if you hadn't seen my previous videos covering that. Just a phenomenal tool. Now, it's not really going to shine in Season 3, only because we have the Seneschal Companion at max rank, just completely alleviating all essence issues. But the moment that that drops back off, and obviously depending on what happens in Season 4 with itemization, I think that the raw power that Bone Prison now brings to your build is going to be something that a lot of people won't notice until that change, and they're going to really appreciate it. On top of that, the change to the Corporeal Glyph, which says that per minion you gain 1% movement speed. Well, Bone Prison counts as minions. So when you have a full Bone Prison out, that's 6 minions, that's 6 additional movement speed, unless they have changed something about how that bugged interaction typically works. Just means that you move faster for using Bone Prison on the hybrid, most notably, or on Bone Spirit itself. So that's also just kind of like a nice thing. You drop your Bone Prison, it applies your vulnerable, you blow it up, you keep moving forward. And as long as you have that Bone Prison down, you're gaining movement speed. It's something that, again, I don't think a lot of people are going to like really appreciate until later, but at least for right now, I'm thinking like, hey, that's kind of sick for the development space of the build and its relative strength moving forward. Another weird thing, and I just kind of want to call this out in particular, it's the Hardened Bones aspect. Hardened Bones said that your minions gain 20% damage reduction. It now says that you also gain 20% damage reduction, making it strictly better than the Might aspect, which says that you have to use a basic skill to gain 6 seconds worth of 20% damage reduction. It also means for hardcore characters, you could just take Hardened Bones and toss it onto your amulet and just have a permanent 30% damage reduction, which is actually like kind of nutty. I definitely think it's going to be a pretty good placeholder until you have your Uber Uniques in the endgame or even your Deathless Visage. And just being able to choose to have 20% damage reduction is kind of like a build your own Shaco at home. That's why I'm going to have it as a buff across the board. It's just a early game progression, really good option for survivability, depending on how the game shifts moving forward as the meta develops. Now, very specifically for Bone Spirit in the Bone Spear-It hybrid, these are things that don't pertain to Bone Spear itself. But in those very specific examples, we did regain the Blood Boil vampiric power as an aspect, meaning that we can choose to have our Bone Spirit overpower once every 20 seconds, bringing back the Spirit Bomb Necromancer. If you never saw my build guide from Season 2, it's something I thought was completely dead since they removed the vampiric powers. But with the addition of Blood Boil, it means that you could put it on, get your automatic overpower, and then use that additional scaling for one-shotting. This is going to make Bone Spirit completely equivalent to Barbarians for one-shot bonk potential against Lilith as well as Duriel. So I wouldn't be surprised if you now see Bone Spirit Necromancers in your farming rotations there, as opposed to always relying on having a Barbarian around. The other thing that I will say, just because it's kind of hard to really like conceptualize this, but you remember at the beginning of the season where you have to level up a character and you don't have all of your gear and you're running around typically with your skeletons? In general, the buffs to skeletons, and most notably the fix to the Reaper skeletons, is going to make it so that the leveling experience for the Necromancer across the board is just strictly better. If you weren't relying on your skeletons for additional utility, resource generation, corpse generation, and just overall tankiness and taunting, then you're probably doing something wrong with your early game progression. And in here, regaining some of that power onto those minions, as well as their utility function, and the fact that something like Heart and Bones now says that they survive and you survive. Juggernaut giving us a ton of armor, meaning that we don't have to worry about having armor on our gear, meaning that more of our stats can generally be lent to our summons to help their like increase survival. Just means that leveling on the Necromancer is probably going to start feeling just as good as it did when the game first released, with the small amount of buffs that they're just adding on to all of these systems that get utilized in the early game. So while it's not specific to any Necromancer build in general, what I do think is that for Bone Spear in the hybrid, it's going to make that leveling experience even better than it was previously. And I already thought in Season 3 that it was pretty phenomenal as it stood. So for those three builds, Bone Spear, Bone Spirit, and the hybrid, you're going to see not really like a ton of movement in the tier list. Bone Spear was already S tier for endgame, already S tier for speed farming. On top of that, Bone Spirit really didn't gain altogether that much other than a cool new boss killing mechanism that just makes it easier to one-shot. You already could reach ridiculous damage on Bone Spirit, but that was going to help it out a little bit more. I do think that Bone Spirit just kind of stays in the B tier across the board. But for this tier list, at least for my personal one, I have added on the hybrid, both in A tier for the end game and in A tier for speed farming, and then up in B tier for the leveling experience, because I actually had a great time on Bone Spear, adding on Bone Spirit just as an essence generation tool, then as a big nuke tool, and then eventually transitioning just to pure Bone Spear. So I do think that the leveling experience is actually pretty top notch. Obviously nowhere near Blood Surge, but definitely high in the B tier. For the next section of builds, we're going to be talking about the Darkness builds. And oddly enough, there is obviously some overlap for things that are going to empower them, but each one of them has gained something very specific that I just want to touch on, so you get a better idea of why I think that they have moved in the tier list in the way that they have. For Infinimist in particular, and again, when we're talking about Infinimist, remember that we're typically talking about the critical strike damage focused X-Files version of this build. There are two changes that I think are going to help to speed it up when it's already in the S tier in my mind in Season 3. These are just going to push them over. So the first one is a little bit innocuous, but it's actually the buff to Penitent Greaves. For Penitent Greaves, they put in a very small little buff here, which is that they increase the amount of multiplicative damage you do against chilled targets from 10% to 15%. And the reason why I want to call this out very specifically for Infinimist is because typically on an Infinimist build, you are going to blood mist through your targets, leaving behind your blood-soaked aspect, leaving behind your corpse explosions, leaving behind bone storms, and now simultaneously leaving behind a chilled trail. And why is that so important? Well, it turns out that being able to add on a bunch of multipliers for Infinimist is one of the best ways to help scale its damage. That works for every single build, right? But it is very specifically my most recent playthrough of Infinimist in Season 3, where I wanted to test just how negatively it was impacted by the nerfs to it. Remember, they reduced the Blighted Corpse Explosion damage. Although the tooltip doesn't represent that, a chat member pointed that out to me, so I am going to go need to test it. It might just be the tooltip. They might have just forgot to nerf it. But on top of that, they reduced the lucky hit chance of Corpse Explosion as a base skill. And I was kind of afraid that the build was just going to be dead in the water. And it turns out it just wasn't. It was just as disgusting as it had always been. The Seneschal helped to be able to scale its single target damage, its ability to stagger a boss very quickly, as well as stacking additional crit chance to always be getting 100% efficiency out of X-Falls. And what I noticed on the build, and again, most notably in the fact that they are giving us more movement speed on Death's Approach, means that I don't think that you actually need a mobility aspect on your Necromancer Infinimist build. I think that Penitent Greaves, along with the fact that it gives the huge amount of movement speed after you evade, considering we're spending the majority of our time in the Blood Mist animation, means that we just get to benefit from this free 15% damage multiplier. And I think I've been sleeping on it for a little bit, but I'm definitely going to retest this as we move into the Gauntlet. Because again, Infinimist was already great, and being able to stack on another multiplier effectively for free might be the thing that really pushes it over for being able to make sure that any monsters left behind you are absolutely going to die. They're going to be slower, they're going to be stuck inside of all of your overlapping damage over time effects. And then on top of that, applying a consistent source of chill is just another great option for being able to stagger bosses even more quickly, which is where we tend to unlock the majority of our damage on an Infinimist build against a boss. So I think that that's another kind of sub-use of these boots that isn't necessarily getting its time in the sunlight. That being said, looking at Penitent Greaves, I think that they ultimately are suffering from old design fatigue here, where none of the stats are actually unique on these boots. The crowd control duration, the slow duration reduction are effectively nothing burger stats. Crowd control duration isn't completely nothing. The slow duration absolutely is. I would love to see them actually add on a new unique stat here, whether it be a lucky hit chance ability to apply chill or frozen, lucky hit chance against a frozen target to make them kind of in line with what Greaves of the Empty Tomb are very specifically for the Necromancer, but something to really set these apart on top of the new buff to the overall damage that you do to chilled targets. The second big thing here is that they actually added a little instantaneous damage source to Crippling Darkness, a very underutilized passive in our skill tree, now that you don't really need to rely on its stun for being able to stagger bosses. But with the addition of this damage source to it, it might be just one of those things, again, to help stack on additional damage. Since it's an instance of damage, and we can go look at the verbiage here just to kind of, corroborate that. But what it now says is that it has a lucky hit chance to be able to stun, which it always did. And then it also deals a 0.2 damage, coefficient of shadow damage to the target. That's the exact same as Shadow Blight. They effectively added on lucky hit chance, proc Shadow Blight. And Infinimist really likes applying lucky hit chance at an incredibly high rate. So basically doubling your total output from the Shadow Blight proc damage for all intents and purposes shouldn't be slept on. This is probably going to be a pretty huge overall increase to the damage of the build, especially in scenarios where X-Falls hasn't procced yet, or you're hitting a dry spell of X-Falls procs. It's just adding on another free damage source, and I think that this is something that, in addition to potentially throwing Metamorphosis back onto the build, to be able to regain the lucky hit chance from Metamorphosis for proccing Hued Flesh, etc., or the addition of the Penitent Greaves, where we don't really need any other stats on that typical piece of gear, is just going to kind of bump it over. On top of that, and this is the last thing, and I almost completely forgot about it, they buffed Blight. Blight is a phenomenal skill. It used to say increase your damage by 15%. Now it says increase your damage by 20%. So the Blight skill, which we're already using to increase our lucky hit chance, as well as just increasing our overall damage output, is just doing that more strongly now. Infinimist is just going to wreck shop in the majority of content, which it already does. And I think that while they didn't necessarily intend to buff Infinimist in these ways, just kind of adding these back onto the kit is bringing back some of that damage and power that we lost walking into this season. With Sever, basically everything I just said is still true. 1, we gained more mobility. 2, we regained Metamorphosis for being able to use Flicker Step and to be able to trigger lucky hit chance, use that as an alternative for Lidless Wall, for maintaining Bone Storms, etc. The early game is just going to feel significantly better. Minions are going to survive a lot better, so you can use the Sever gains a multiplier of damage if you already have your vulnerability application figured out on your build. But they had the audacity to literally buff every single thing about Sever. They buffed the initial damage Sever does, they buffed the return damage that Sever does. They buffed the damage that it deals as it passes through enemies, and since that always scaled off your initial damage, they actually double buffed the damage of this, since they increased its base amount and they increased your initial damage as well. And then on top of that, they made it so that Sever applies vulnerable for 3 seconds as opposed to 2 seconds. And that might not seem incredibly important with the Seneschal at max ranks, with Tempest and Arcing and applying vulnerable. But remember, 1, the Seneschal goes away eventually, but on top of that, your Sever build actually needs to maintain as many multipliers simultaneously and has kind of a ramping damage issue similar to the Blood builds. But in this way, being able to proactively apply vulnerable more often, just increasing its damage outright in every single facet, means that every part of Sever gameplay is just going to feel significantly better. The only thing right now, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but the only thing right now keeping Sever out of S tier in my mind is the fact that it has to ramp its damage at all. And whereas opposed to ramping damage like Corpse Explosion or Blight, typically you'd say like, well, those ramp too, right? And you absolutely do, except that the damage output that they get to eclipses that what Sever could before these changes. So obviously I'll need to pilot the build again to get a better idea of just how well it feels. But I do think that its ramp potential is still keeping it out of S tier, but this boy is sitting at top of A tier for me right now across the board. Now talking about Blight, basically everything I said about Infinimist, except they also just buffed all of Blight's damage. Blight, in my mind, is actually already an S tier build. It was kind of nutty how quickly you can ramp your damage with it, especially while using like Plunging Darkness tech on Bone Prison, which is also just going to be strictly better now. But they gain more mobility, they gain more damage, they can use Intercom for a boss killing aspect, they increased how much Blight does across the board as well. It's just kind of nutty. Honestly, at some point, they just got to ask the question like, do we just need to turn it into a new skill? But they increased how much damage it does on impact. They increased how much damage it does over time. They increased the strength of the immobilization if you do use paranormal, which is a pretty decent tech option for being able to stagger bosses, or at least it was. But the increase to supernatural blight, just bringing it up to a full 20% damage multiplier, means you could basically use this on every single build as a setup for boss killing, just get a huge additional multiplier effectively for free. But what that means is that Blight's damage is just going to be better, its mobility is better, its overall survivability is better because you can put more of your damage onto your gear, since we don't really have to worry about that, especially in the gauntlet where everything is only level 124. I think that Blight is probably still being slept on too much. I know we kind of say that a lot, right? It's like when I want to add value to what I'm saying, I say that it's slept on. But unironically, Blight, in my mind, might even be stronger than Infinimist, depending on what the arena is of what you're trying to compare them against, because of how crazy powerful its damage output is. You basically just have to wait 2 seconds for it to ramp, and then it just melts everything on the screen. It's like kind of nutty, honestly. So here, Infinimist, I think, finally bumps up into the S tier for the endgame tier list, at least on the Necromancer. It's going to be hard to compare that against things like the Barbarian, right? But here for the Necromancer, absolutely back up into the S tier. We never had anything to worry about there. In the A tier, you'll see that I brought Blight up to A tier, and the only reason why it's not in the S tier is because I had 4 different builds in the S tier, and that made me ask the question, what does it mean to be in the S tier? And I think you have to start looking through like a very, very fine mesh to figure out what the differences are and what really changes your estimation of these builds. So I'm happily moving it high up into the A tier for right now. Sever is in the A tier, like I said, across the board. Blight is also in the A tier for speed farming, and it's also in the A tier for the leveling build as well. Oh, and I don't know how this wasn't here before, but Infinimist is absolutely an S tier speed farmer as well. Let's just go ahead and add that in post credits there. Okay, just to temper your expectation, Bloodlance basically got absolutely nothing here. I don't know why, honestly, and I kind of want to use Bloodlance as an example to highlight that probably controversial thing I said at the beginning, which was the Nothing Burger addition of the vampiric powers in this season, at least for the Necromancer. Here's the rub. Bloodlance already can't fit on every single piece of gear that it would want to fit on to be fully optimal. You are always making a compromise somewhere. It wants to use a unique amulet. It sometimes wants to use 2 unique rings. It wants to use a Shaco on its helmet. It wants to use Mutilator Plate. It wants to use Blood Moon Breeches. It also wants to use Grandfather sometimes, as well as Doombringer, although not really. You shouldn't use Doombringer on Bloodlance. And it very typically wants to use a Lidless Wall. What does that mean? You have almost no aspect room to actually be able to fit on gear or alternative offensive aspects. And since the majority of things that you may want to put onto your build here are either defensive aspects, which we don't have room for, or offensive aspects, which we don't have room for, it means that we effectively don't gain anything from the addition of the vampiric powers as aspects. Now, it was logical for them to do this, and in fact, I effectively begged them to do this as opposed to giving us new unique items. As a unique item, we are already overstuffed, we are oversaturated with options, so if we got Metamorphosis boots, I would have screamed until my voice went hoarse. So I am glad that they exist as aspects. But when you really sit down and look at what the Necromancer is already using across the board, you kind of can't fit in the vast majority of these, at least not in an endgame build. Now, during leveling and early game progression, absolutely, a ton of these are going to be fantastic. I think Metamorphosis out of all of them has the biggest potential to be used on builds only because it says unstoppable. It turns out when you're moving at 200% movement speed, you really don't need to worry about having a slightly more efficient evade as a mobility tool, but we sure do want unstoppable, and some builds don't want to use Blood Mist or don't want to deal with the jankiness of it. They want unstoppable on demand. So Metamorphosis is going to make a showing. The fact that it has a downside at all, while it made sense when the developers first said it to me, and if you use cooldown reduction on some builds, it's not that bad. If you have the audacity to put it onto your amulet, which is where I might end up using it on a lot of different builds, it's not that bad. But this thing didn't need to have a downside. honestly, especially with the introduction of Juggernaut, where Juggernaut effectively resolves all survivability issues. They just have two cool things that are both begging to make your evade effectively unusable in the majority of circumstances with how long the cooldown is. So while at first I got it, now after looking at it again, I think it's absolutely trash city. Just absolutely remove this, no question, or make it like 1 to 5 seconds. I don't know. This thing needs to go away. But you see the issue here. Where do you fit these things on? A lot of builds would love lucky hit chance to be able to apply vulnerable for 20 seconds if this works, like how the Vampiric power worked in season 2. But where do I fit this offensive aspect that basically just says apply vulnerable? If you're looking at the Bone Spear Necromancer, I have Splintering, which says that my Bone Spear's splinters apply vulnerable to targets and increase their damage. I would never use a thing that just says apply vulnerable. And then as you go down the list, while there are some very niche uses, the majority of the time you just can't fit these onto Necro builds. So one, I think they just need to move more of the power from aspects back into the skill tree, like a lot of people tend to think at this point, so that we can actually make room to use all these cool aspects so that we can actually change how our builds are customized. Okay, great. So now that we went through all of that, Bloodlance basically got nothing. It got a little bit more mobility. Its ability to use your Necromancer summons in the early game make leveling on it not that much better, because Bloodlance leveling is just kind of trash city, but at least it is better. Obviously, the Corpse Explosion package is also there for people using Black River and Sacrilegious, but kind of across the board, Bloodlance didn't get anything. And that's okay, because Blood Surge is absolutely the new hotness. They took this skill, cranked it up to 1,000,000, and then had the audacity to say, oh, we also made its aspect better. So what am I talking about here? They took the power that you got from draining enemies and pushed it into the base of the skill. And for that to make sense, you need to have an idea of how Blood Surge currently works. So Blood Surge does 20% of your weapon damage at rank 1 from monsters on the entirety of the screen. This is the drain portion of the skill. Based off of how many enemies that you drained, you then got a multiplier to Blood Surge's Nova, the close range damage component that comes out after. This can only hit a total bonus of 50% multiplier, and that's why Blood Surge feels amazing for leveling in Domhain tunnels or dopamine tunnels. It's why it feels great in the overworld, in Hell Tides. It even feels really good in dungeons until you get to a boss, and then it feels like trash city in comparison to other builds that don't need to worry about stacking max fortify and then also making sure to always be overpowering, etc., etc. So what they did was they made it harder to reach this 50% damage multiplier. So whereas before you had to hit 5 targets, now you have to hit 10 targets. They didn't change ultimately what the total damage bonus is, but you need more targets to hit that same multiplier. Mac, that sounds like trash. Don't worry about it, fam. They increased the base damage of the skill by 40%. So just to give you an idea of how much damage you used to get, against a single target, you used to get a 10% damage multiplier for Blood Surge's damage. You now, with the 5% from a single target and the 40% of the base damage, gain a 42% damage multiplier against that target. That's right, they increased your damage against single targets by 320%. That's bananas cakes, unironically, in comparison to what the damage multiplier used to be. Obviously, they didn't give us a 3.2 multiplier, just very specifically in the relationship between the previous 10% and the new 42%. But still, looking at what boss kill speed was already like on Blood Surge, it was getting pretty decent at this point. They've added on enough damage to the class, as well as just like the overall power of builds in Diablo 4, where it wasn't the worst thing on the planet, it just vastly underperformed other things. That being said, not only did they increase the damage of Blood Surge itself, they also increased the damage for Blood Bathed aspect. Blood Bathed aspect says that your Blood Surge Nova echoes again, and I'll let you know, the damage bonus that you got from this, which at max was just a 1.5 multiplier, because you would do another Blood Surge, which would deal damage equal to 50% of your previous one. So it's just a 1.5 multiplier. Not terrible, but it was almost so inefficient and ineffective that I personally stopped using Blood Bathed on Blood Surge because you just didn't need it. But now what it says is that your Blood Surge is going to deal only 10% less damage, making it a 1.9 total multiplier. So you don't need to put it on an amulet, you don't need to put it on a two-hander, because taking your 10% and reducing it to 7.5% or to 5%, while comparatively a huge damage increase, realistically isn't. So you could just throw this back onto your gloves, and we are going to get a significantly larger boost out of this aspect. So not only did they increase the base damage by 40%, giving you a total of a 42% damage bonus against a single target, but they also took arguably what should be the best aspect for the build and increased its efficiency by 400%. Wild. Blood Surge skyrocketing, stonks going through the roof. Now, what does that mean for our tier list? I sat down and I thought about this a lot because it's very easy to get caught up in hype. And I think you're going to see a lot of hype coming out of a lot of Necro content creators, just kind of across the board, because they give us so many new goodies here. But I wanted to be as like objective and analytical in my approach to understanding this. And even if my best efforts to not overhype this, I do think that Blood Surge finally joins both Bone Spear and Infinimist as an S tier build in the end game. It was already an S tier build for speed farming. And then for Blood Surge leveling, remember how everybody says Blood Surge is the best leveling build? Well, it was, and it still is. Now it's so much better. Basically, all of the other builds that you could play on the Necromancer need to drop down like 2 tiers, because not only did they make its damage better, not only did they make its best aspect, which is from the Codex of Power, strictly stronger than it ever was before, but on top of that, they also went ahead and buffed our minions. It made minions better in the early game. It made them have better utility, and Reapers actually generate corpses. And they increased corpse explosion damage. Now you get to use that as a legitimate tool to further increase your AoE and single target damage. Blood Surge leveling is disgusting. I don't know of another build in this game that even vaguely comes close to the crazy amounts of efficiency that this build has. So while it was already in the S tier, it's now in Omega S tier. It's in S+++. If I could add 17 carats to this thing showing you that it is now the best S tier, there you go. Don't play anything else if you're trying to get to level 100 as fast as possible. Minion builds. Everybody's going to be super stoked for minion builds, and I think that it's warranted. I think they gave us enough buffs where minions won't feel like trash for their base damage. Now, I know that there are a lot of people out there who like to say that minion builds are phenomenal, they're fantastic, they're super strong. There was a time where people saying minion builds this season were going to be S tier. It turns out that's just not true. It just isn't. Why? Because it turns out that the minion package is just clunky and bad in comparison to other builds. That's not different now. But they did buff them a whole bunch. They buffed your skirmishers and your defenders damage by 30% and their health by 10%. They buffed the reapers damage by 20% and health by 10%. They increased all of your mages damage by 20% and increased their health by 10%. They increased your golems damage by 30%. And that's probably actually the biggest change here, but we'll talk about a couple other things after that, and increased its life by 20%. The Heart and Bones change says that you gain damage reduction, and they gain damage reduction. The Corporeal Glyph says that you now gain movement speed from having your minions. The funny part about that is Corporeal Glyph only increases physical damage, so this doesn't increase either cold or shadow mage damage. It only increases bone mage damage. That's kind of lame, but like, yeah, no, whatever. They increased how much damage Cult Leader is giving your minions by an additional 50%. On top of that, they fixed the bug where attack speed in your Paragon board wasn't actually increasing your Cult Leader damage. So now that's going to work as well. They really put a ton of additional bonuses here. Oh, and they also increased Hellbent Commander by another 50%. The issue is that Hellbent Commander is complete trash, and I'm going to have a separate video where I point out just how completely trash it is. But let me just very quickly share this little image from it in case you don't believe me. Did you know that these white circles is roughly how close you need to be to your minions to actually get the Hellbent Commander bonus to them? And that you could tell that your skeletons have the Hellbent Commander bonus if they have these little blue orbs around their hands. So you'll notice that this skeleton that's just on the other side of the target doesn't have it. Oh, and you'll notice that my mages also don't have it. And in fact, if I was actually just standing right here, none of my minions would gain the bonus from Hellbent Commander. Yeah, that's a problem. It's an absolutely trash passive. They 100% need to change how it works, but I have a whole video that's going to be complaining about that. But if you are near your skeletons, they got an additional 50% boost from this passive, and that's pretty significant. So all that said and told, both pure minions as well as shadow minions, and I do think that shadow minions kind of comes out on top here because they have access to Blight, and they also have access to Crippling Darkness. On top of all of that, they also fixed a bug with thorns, something that I'm going to go ahead and claim this one. Boopity boop, 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 boopity boop. I personally reported this one. I know that I got this into the developer's hands, and it got fixed in this patch, and it's super important, and not enough people are going to appreciate it until I come out with some kind of video to be able to prove this. But it turns out that thorns only ever triggered Abhorrent Decrepify, but didn't trigger Hewed Flesh. Now, why is that important? Well, it turns out auto-procking corpse generation from thorns, which may now work with our minions as well, considering thorns on our minions did work with Abhorrent Decrepify, means that just having 1 point in spiked armor or the Ring of Mendeln on is going to turn all of your skeletons into corpse production mills that you can then use for a hyper-efficient corpse explosion build on top of things like Army of the Dead or Since we potentially won't need that anymore, if Thorns will actually trigger this at a rate that matters, it means that we can go back to using Bone Storm and still have enough corpses that to always use whatever you need to be able to resummon your minions, be able to empower them with Raised Skeleton, as well as just generally increasing all of our damage from corpse consumption. So that being said, summoner builds are going to feel significantly better. I don't think that the raw damage output from the skeletons is somehow going to be like revolutionized by these changes, but your golem is going to absolutely crack dudes in the head at mock speed. And that's kind of good enough. So like I said, on top of everything that I kind of just exposed about for normal minions, shadow minions are also going to gain Blight. Now, yes, you can use Blight on any build. I just like to differentiate these two things because I think there's a very specific Shadow Blight focused version of playing minions. And then there's Kalan's Edict. Well, there's other ways of playing minions, which I consider to be pure minions. So yes, just all in all, just like significantly more powerful. What does that mean for the tier lists though? I bumped pure minions up into the C tier, both for endgame and for speed farming. I know that there are people out there screaming, Mac, minions, thorns, they can do every single content, they can do every single thing. I agree, they can do all content. The best example that I can see of a Thorns minion build like crushing content isn't good. I'm sorry, it just doesn't compare to Bone Spirit, doesn't compare to Infinimist, doesn't compare to Blight, Sever, Blood Surge, it doesn't even compare to Blood Lance. It's just not even vaguely close. And until somebody shows me something, comment down below if you really think that you have like a video that proves to me that Thorns minions is clearing at the same speed as any of the other meta builds. I will very quickly change my tune. This isn't a fake engagement poll. Quite literally, prove it to me and I'll change what I'm saying. But as it stands right now, I do think that summon builds are squarely in the C tier, kind of across the board. Bumping up pure summon back up into C tier, where I think Shadow Summoner always kind of had a pretty decent little seat at the table, makes sense to me. There we go. That's covering all of the patch notes. If it turns out that I end up cutting up this video into the different sections, I'm sorry, you are going to see the same end screen here because I'm just going to include this for that reference. But if I leave it all together, this was a 44-minute long recording. So if you made it all the way through, thank you so much. I super appreciate it. Let me know what you think down in the comments. Do you think that I'm way off in some of my predictions? Do you have different predictions? Did you see anything that I missed out on? Or do you think that some builds are being undersold or underutilized in ways that we could reinvestigate when we bring that information to bear? I'd really like to hear what you're also considering running for the Gauntlet. I don't think that my mind's been changed really. I think I'm still going to approach it with Bone Spear, but there's definitely a world where Blood Surge is now just bumped up super high in the tier lists there. And even in some ways, maybe Infinimist is a really good option to be able to basically like run and gun and never have to stop. But I'd love to hear from you. If you're brand new here and you liked what you saw, consider subscribing to the channel. I would really appreciate it. We've kind of stagnated on YouTube, I'm not going to lie to you. Now, almost certainly part of that is due to the fact that I haven't been putting out as many videos, but it's because I try to bring like a pretty like crazy amount of like attention to detail to these things. So I'm just not able to pump them out at the same speed that other people might be able to. So if you haven't already, I would appreciate it, but that's enough shilling for me. Thank you so much for watching this video. I truly hope that it helps. And as always, I look forward to seeing you in the next video.